right, well, let's get started. Free blacks during the antebellum period. And for us, the antebellum period will basically be from 1820, until about 1860, or the onset, if you will, of the Civil War, which of course happens in 1861. But anyway, 1820 to 1860 suits our purposes just fine. All right, demographics of free blacks. So understand that the free blacks are growing in numbers. I suppose by 1820, feel free to double check me on this, but I believe it was somewhere around like 1.5. I don't know. Well, hang on. How many was it? No. Wait a minute. Something like I don't know, more or less about somewhere between 150 to 200,000, if you will, free blacks, something like that. No, about no, hang on. No, I know. It was about 233,000 free blacks. Um, and then you wind up getting about maybe somewhere a little less than 500,000 free blacks, something like 480,000 or something like that. Well, at any rate, the number had more than doubled. Now, the problem was, well, other than the fact, I guess there could always be more of them, but the problem was that you would say, okay, well, it looks like they are making a real threat and making real dent, if you will, in the number of slaves. Well, slaves were somewhere in the neighborhood of a little bit over 1.5 million, increasing to about 3.9, very short of about 4 million slaves. And that's the slaves that, had been accounted for in the census. The number of slaves had actually slightly outpaced, if you will, the free blacks. Okay, so obviously free blacks had to be feeling a pinch there. But then you look at, if you will, the number of whites that will increase. If you the number of whites will increase from 1820 to 1860 threefold. About 7 million, well, a little bit more, I suppose. 7 million. Actually, no. Hang on a second. Maybe about closer to 8 to 9 million slaves. Free whites. Then you get to about just short of 27 million by 1860. Now, what is fueling this? Obviously, naturally increase. There are more and more folks coming, but you also have what is known as the so-called old immigration, and this old immigration, if you will, is bringing out slaves in. I keep saying that whites in large numbers. They're coming, if you will, from Ireland, coming, if you will, from Germany, Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, for example. They're coming from these places. So they're lagging behind the general population. Now, when you rank these, I suppose it depends upon who you look at, but somewhere between the North and the Upper South that has more free blacks. Sometimes you listen, you'll hear that the Upper South had more. Sometimes you hear the North had more, but somewhere between those two had more free blacks. One thing was for sure, you get about 30,000 free blacks in the lower South, and that's nowhere near what the free blacks have, what the North has, or what the Upper South has. Nowhere near it. I mean, both of those are approaching, if not exceeding, 100,000. or so. Even a good deal more once you get to 1860 to the 1860s. Um, these guys you're probably looking at in the upper south, maybe about a good 30,000 or so. I'm doing that number off the top of my head. Now, indeed, they are free, but slavery decline in the North can throw you off a little bit. Um, One thing you have to keep in mind is people that you might consider to be free are technically not free. Those are escaped slaves. Um, as they escape north, obviously they feel like they're living as free people, but certainly the South doesn't see it that way. Southern slaveholders don't see it that way, and neither does the Constitution. There's a fugitive slave clause that basically says even though you have escaped up north, you are still a slave. And of course, you have the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which says, okay, you escape, but you can be recaptured. This is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Matter of fact, they can use slave catchers to get you. So, you run into that. And keep in mind, sometimes they made a mistake. I believe, what was it? There was a guy from New York by the name of Solomon Northup, and he escapes, if you will, up north. Excuse me, what did I just tell you? I'm sorry. He was actually born free in New York, and he winds up going to Washington D.C., I believe, and he winds up being captured, if you will, by slave catchers, even though he wasn't even a slave at all. Um, well, now he is for about a good 12 years. So these so-called mistakes often happen. Some of these slave catchers were desperate to meet their numbers, and they figured, well, I'm not going home empty-handed, and so I'm going to enslave, whoever I can, whoever I'm able to enslave. 'Cause a lot of folks up north didn't have free papers. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions about that. All right, now we're going to talk about the black laws. Now, sometimes you hear them called the anti-black laws, which is what they really are. um, but historians call them the black laws. Now, let's keep in mind about the racial attitude of Northerners. Understand that Northern whites' racial attitudes aren't that dissimilar from whites in the South. Not that dissimilar from white Southerners. Um, I mean, obviously they own fewer slaves. I guess by this time, very few Northerners would even have slaves. I guess you would have Connecticut that might have a few, and I guess you would include Delaware as part of the North. But for the most part, the racial attitudes were, that blacks were indeed inferior, that there was not any much use for them, that they could be lazy, certainly weren't intelligent. These were viewpoints that were prevalent in the North. Oftentimes, Northerners, loved to be free of slavery because they'd be free of blacks. Well, there were certainly attempts, if you will, to exclude blacks in the North. Massachusetts and Pennsylvania had both introduced legislation. Members of their assemblies had introduced legislation to exclude blacks from entering into their states. Didn't work, but the fact that somebody would introduce that legislation tells you a great deal. Well, they try in the Northeast, but in many portions of the old Northwest, they succeed. Now, when we talk about the old Northwest, we're really talking about Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, not yet Minnesota, because Minnesota hasn't, they'll become a state in the 1850s, I suppose. And you can also add Iowa into that as well. Um, but really, the old Northwest are these northern states that are west of the Appalachian Mountains. Oh, they had much stronger efforts. In Ohio, they asked you to have free papers. Matter of fact, quite a few of these states asked you to have free papers. They did their best to limit, if you will, black migration, if you will, into these states. I believe Illinois um, said before they became a state, Illinois said, well, if you come into our territory, we're going to whip you until you leave. Um, Later on, Illinois will say, hey, look, you need free papers. You better not hire any of these blacks. These types of things. If you leave 10 miles from a farm or something like that, you may be whipped. They introduced loopholes around slavery that said, that basically you can have black indentured servants. Matter of fact, they at one time had slavery, and they just figured out a number of loopholes to keep blacks as close to slavery as they could. Um, by 1853, Illinois has now said, basically, you cannot come into Illinois at all if you're black. We'll tolerate the ones that are here, but you're not going to be allowed to come into Illinois at all if you're black. And a lot of these states tried to have laws that were similar to that, although never quite as stringent as if you will, Illinois. But a lot of the black laws had to do with was the control of black migration, if not the elimination of black migration altogether. These laws were rough. Now, I will tell you that most people in Illinois had little to no objection to these laws, including a fellow by the name of Abraham Lincoln who had supported these laws. Um, do understand, though, that as long as you kept those numbers low, there was toleration in, I suppose, relatively, small doses as long as they didn't overrun the population. I was in a place like Chicago. How do you keep blacks out? Once you get around someone like like St. Louis, for example, then there's going to be a question, right? And remember, Illinois in particular extended very far south. Um, Cairo, Illinois looks like Cairo. Well, actually, it looks like Cairo, but obviously in Egypt it's pronounced Cairo, right? Cairo. Cairo, Illinois, um, actually extended further. It was actually further south than Richmond, and Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, right? So this gives you an idea of what you're looking at. You got a lot of Southerners in Illinois, in that southern Illinois part. Another thing I want to talk about here, folks, because this continues. Um, Matter of fact, you see a little bit of this today. I mean, a lot of folks in that southern Illinois area, a lot of those older folks probably still have southern accents. In southern Ohio, I ran into this. Portsmouth, Ohio, a lot of those folks have southern accents. Southern Indiana, a lot of those folks have southern accents. And with it, you also have southern attitudes. With it, you have southern attitudes. A lot of those folks are southern. And with the accent, you also have the attitudes as well, which is not going to be a good thing for blacks. As far as citizenship, um, blacks who were allowed to stay in these states were treated clearly not nowhere near as well, if you will, as whites. Um, we'll talk about one important aspect, if you will, of citizenship here, probably in the next slide. But generally they couldn't serve on juries. They couldn't testify against whites. Obviously, the militia laws applied to them. There was a number of privileges that they couldn't enjoy in these states. Um, and of course, miscegenation. I'm not sure if you know what miscegenation is, but if not, I will fill you in. Miscegenation is the is basically interracial or intercultural marriage. So interracial, really interracial marriage, but I guess you could even include intercultural marriage, but interracial marriage. So obviously blacks and whites are not allowed to be married. They weren't allowed to be married in the South, and they're certainly not going to be allowed to be married in the old Northwest, which is virulently just trenched, just steeped, if you will, in white supremacy. Okay, black suffrage. Now, understand when we say black suffrage, we're not talking about black people suffering. I mean, they're suffering, but that's not exactly what I'm getting into per se. Rather, what I am talking about is um, blacks being allowed or not allowed to vote. Um, Indeed, during the Jackson period, um, there had been great attempt to make sure that all white men could vote. Used to be that obviously you had to be white, you had to be male, but you also had to own property. And Jackson is working pretty hard to try to see that all white men can vote. Now, women, you're on your own, and blacks, you better not. But there was an attempt at universal white male suffrage. Well, there's a universal attempt at trying to make sure, well, somewhat universal attempt that blacks don't vote. There were some states that allowed it. Now, it was most stringent in the old Northwest, where basically I don't know of, I think every single one of those old Northwest states said if you were black, you could not vote, period. Um, New York had financial disincentives. Um, I believe you still had property owning. I believe you still had poll taxes that blacks had to pay. It was very difficult for blacks to vote, and a very small um, segment of blacks could vote because of that in New York. All the other middle states said, no, no, we're not even going to do that. You can't vote, period. Um, in New England, I believe Connecticut said you couldn't vote, um, but the other five states did say it. And basically, it is among those five states where blacks are going to be able to vote. So, what is that? Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, um, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. And in many of those states, like Maine, probably very few blacks there. It's not really a threat. So suffrage is pretty much relegated, if you will, to the New England states. I believe some southern states had no code about whether or not slaves could vote. Blacks could vote. Excuse me, not slaves, but blacks could vote. And later, at least around 1830, I don't believe there's a southern state that didn't correct, if you will, that quote unquote error. Um, you get the feeling that it's not particularly easy to be free if you're black here. That there seems to be a different standard of blacks being free as opposed to whites being free. Um, it's going to be harder to govern your life, if you will, as a free black man or woman. In the North, the South, the upper South, the lower South, so on and so forth. Let's see here, yeah, all right. Last slide that I'm going to get into, um, and that is segregation. Um, if you were familiar with a historian, and I'm venturing to guess that you haven't been familiar with this fella, but a guy by the name of C. Van Woodward. He wrote a very old but still very relevant book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow. Keep in mind, according to the same career of Jim Crow, that segregation is really a child, if you will, or the brainchild of the North. More of the North than it is the South. Now, why would that be the case? Well, understand that segregation is a form of control, correct? It's a form of control. Well, most blacks in the South are already under a type of control, aren't they? Institutional slavery. So for the most part, you don't have, I mean, obviously there's some blacks that you got to look at, you know, you're going to take note of. But for the most part, most blacks are in the South are enslaved. You don't have to really worry about their movements, well, except for when they escape or something like that. Um, but in the North, you had some slaves, but now, of course, most of these states will be done with slavery. Connecticut will be done with their gradual transition to freedom in 1848. And I guess, some people count Delaware as a northern state or a middle state. Sometimes they may even put it into the South, but pretty much only Delaware is the one that has slavery up until the Civil War, and most blacks in Delaware are not slaves, so they have very few slaves, if you will, in Delaware. Okay, well, so you're going to see it applied greatly in the North. Segregation. Segregation of all kinds of things, of omnibuses, horse-drawn omnibuses, um, coaches, stage coaches, I guess, um, taverns, um, inns, um, entertainment venues, um, every single form of transportation um, comes to mind, I suppose, as well. So I already talked about stagecoaches. I already talked about omnibuses. I got ahead of myself. But this will also include trains. You're probably going to be in a black part of a train. It's going to include um, boats where you might be, have to, stand outside in the boats. Sleeper cars in the trains. Um, Probably about 1820s or 18 about the 1820s, we have minstrel shows that are coming up, and these minstrel shows, if you're not familiar minstrel shows. There, people, whites, but even later some blacks, if you will, performing, if you will, in blackface. Um, that of course, probably one of the more famous productions, of course, is Jump Jim Crow, or Zip Coon. Another reason why you should be real careful about using that word. um, by the time you get into the 1830s, the word Jim Crow has become synonymous, if you will, with segregation. Now, there's a good chance that most, if not many, of these minstrel shows were probably performed in the North anyway, but, um, well, certainly many of them. But by this time, Jim Crow has become synonymous with segregation. And so you had these Jim Crow cars. Or these were the cars on a train, right? Um, compartments, cars being compartments of trains, um, where blacks were supposed to sit. And this gives us our first introduction, if you will, to Frederick Douglass, who always, the clarion call from Frederick Douglass was always integration over segregation. And he didn't like it when blacks did it, which, usually if blacks did it, they had no choice. And they didn't like it when whites did it. And so he decided to sit in a white car. Now, of course, Frederick Douglass was half white, at least, at the very least half white. Um, but with that being said, he wouldn't pass if he would a paper bag test, if you get my meaning. At any rate, he wound up sitting, if you will, on the coach, sitting, if you will, in the white compartment. And they tried to take him out, and according to him, he held on so fast, if you will, to the to his seat that supposedly, he took the seat with him. He wound up, they had to pull him and the seat off. Now, one thing I do want to say to you all is that you're also going to have, if you will, black neighborhoods. And I believe I'll probably be talking about this in the next one anyway. But in these black neighborhoods, so you have these segregated neighborhoods. You may ask somebody, where to go. If I'm in Boston, where do I find the black people? If you'll forgive the language, well, oh yeah, you go over there to Nigger Hill. I think another place, it was Little Africa, and you had all these places. But one thing was for sure, when they talked about um, these homes were oftentimes dilapidated and in pretty rough shape. And one thing you got to keep in mind is that white Southerners often love hearing these stories. And why is that? Because the basic reason was they felt that the best place for black people to be taken care of was not in the North, not in Great Britain, um, not in Africa, but on a southern plantation. That's the best place for them, according to what white Southerners would say, especially planters, slaveholders. And nothing made them happier to hear that blacks were suffering in these conditions, because it gave for them more validity to the argument that blacks were best suited on, if you will, southern plantations. All right. Well, anyway, that's the end for this. We will continue talking about northern black families here in the next talk. All right. Take care. Bye bye.